There are cases where the legal files are just a few hundred pages long, but the public debate lasts more than a century. Lizzie Borden is one of the most well-known and most debated examples in American true crime history. In 1892, inside a locked house in Fall River, Massachusetts, 2 members of a family were found dead. What was strange was that the crime scene showed no obvious signs of foul play. Of the 3 people left in the house that day, all suspicion quickly turned to one. But there was no concrete evidence to convict. The court declared her not guilty. The public was furious. I went through every statement, every deposition, disjointed conversations, conflicting details, blurry timelines. But what kept me from closing the file wasn't just the missing timestamps or the disappearance of a certain dress. It was how people reacted to her silence. Lizzie never uttered a word, not during questioning, not under pressure. And perhaps that silence is what made forgiveness so difficult. In Fall River, the story was rewritten through collective memory, from jump rope rhymes sung by children to untraceable rumors about Lizzie's temper, her habits, or her private life. The truth wasn't enough to convict her in court, but it also wasn't enough to shield her from society's verdict. More than 100 years have passed, yet the name Lizzie Borden still carries weight. A collective memory that remains unresolved, a symbol without a conviction, but also without absolution. To this day, there's no definitive conclusion, but Lizzie Borden has become a cultural figure, often seen as a female serial killer without a clear motive, because the debates never really stopped. And perhaps the most haunting part lies in how society looked at a woman they couldn't define. Somewhere between familiarity and suspicion, between silence and truth. I still don't know what makes this case so persistent. Was it because she was a prominent social figure? Or was it that something unacceptable seemed to happen within a family that looked perfectly ordinary? In true crime documentaries, the echoes often come from what's been overlooked, from the silences left untouched, where truth is revealed not through speech, but through silence that stretches across generations. In most true crime records, I spend more time on the notes about her childhood. Beyond searching for explanations of her behavior, I genuinely want to understand how relationships in that house were held together by a kind of silent logic. Andrew Borden came from a working-class background and rose through strict investment, frugality, and almost absolute financial discipline. Despite holding considerable wealth, he chose to live in a modest house located in a middle-class neighborhood, one without electricity, without running water, and without a clear line between employer and servant. That frugality was seen as virtue, and silence was considered a standard. In that environment, Lizzie grew up alongside her sister Emma, the one she called Amaikin Surso, the only person who ever stood by me, but also the one who introduced the first limits in her life. Emma had promised their late mother to take care of her younger sister, and she treated it as a duty passed down. That very sense of obligation made the bond between them, though close, never quite equal. Later, when their father married Abby Durfee, the relationship between her and the 2 daughters remained distant. In the available records, there is no indication that any emotional connection ever formed. Lizzie never called her mother, and shared meals became less frequent, as if by quiet agreement. Lizzie's teenage years left no striking marks. Apart from her regular church attendance, Sunday school teaching, and active participation in women's charitable groups, those around her described her as quiet, reserved, somewhat serious, an entirely normal image in the social context of the time. But in a household where affection was measured by order and silence was treated as a code of conduct, when Andrew decided to transfer part of his property to Abby's relatives, There was no official record of how Emma and Lizzie reacted. But after that event, the reports began to note that Lizzie dined alone, spoke less, and withdrew. After returning from a trip to Europe, Lizzie started referring to Abby as Mrs. Borden. Meals became quieter, and the hierarchy in the household seemed to exist only on paper. All these changes happened without a sound, but they were observed piece by piece through the testimonies of the maid, the neighbors, and close friends. In many cases of true crime, people search for causes. But in stories like Lizzie's, what matters may not be what happened, but how everything slowly lost its ability to connect, long before anyone realized that this was something to be concerned about. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, the Borden household woke earlier than usual. The maid, Bridget Sullivan, served breakfast to Mr. and Mrs. Andrew and Abby Borden. The older daughter, Emma, had gone to visit friends, while the younger daughter, Lizzie, a 32-year-old unmarried Sunday school teacher, was still asleep. A little later, Mr. Andrew left the house and Mrs. Abby went upstairs to tidy the guest room. When Mr. Andrew returned home, Lizzie came downstairs and said that Mrs. Borden had gone out after hearing that a friend had fallen ill. Lizzie and her sister Emma always referred to Abby, their stepmother, as Mrs. Borden. Mr. Andrew believed his daughter and went to the bedroom. However, he stayed there only briefly before moving down to the sitting room. Meanwhile, Bridget, the maid, returned to her room because she wasn't feeling well. According to her testimony, she woke up to Lizzie shouting that her father was no longer alive. I've read that testimony many times. There are several inconsistencies in the timeline. Inside the 3-story house, everything unfolded in absolute silence. The police noted that the scene was orderly. The front door was locked from the inside. The windows were all latched securely. Mr. Andrew was found dead in the sitting room. The pillow under his head was still in place. There were no signs of self-defense on his body. Bridget claimed she hadn't heard a thing, even though she was just a few meters away, separated by a single wall. Mrs. Abby was discovered later, lying face down on the 2nd floor. Her death had occurred before Mr. Andrews by at least 90 minutes. And during that entire time, only one person remained in the house, Lizzie. When responders arrived, Lizzie was standing near the steps, dressed neatly, her voice steady, showing no signs of panic. She said she had just returned from the backyard chicken coop and was shocked to find her father unresponsive in the sitting room. As for Mrs. Abby, Lizzie first said she didn't know where she had gone. Moments later, she suggested that perhaps she came back and went upstairs. Her statements began to repeat, with minor contradictions, but enough to raise suspicion. One officer later wrote, "She didn't show any sense of guilt, nor did she display the slightest fear when we began investigating the scene." I understand why he chose the word show. In cases like this, investigators examine not just the crime scene, but how a person maintains composure. Bridget said Lizzie changed clothes that very afternoon. When asked about it, Lizzie explained that her old dress had paint stains. 3 days later, she burned that dress in the kitchen stove. In criminal psychology, behaviors that seem entirely normal in the context of an emergency are often the first signs of something deeply abnormal. At first, the police didn't suspect Lizzie Borden at all. There was no concrete evidence. But really, who else could have done it when her statements didn't line up at all? There were also inconsistencies in the timeline. If Abby had been killed in the morning, the perpetrator would have had to stay inside the house for several hours, waiting for Andrew to return. That meant the killer could have been seen by Lizzie or by Bridget Sullivan. So logically, the most likely suspect was someone in the household, either Lizzie or Sullivan. The police began to focus on the timeline, minute by minute, statement by statement. But the more they compared, the more confused things became. The 90-minute gap between the two deaths was a red flag. If Lizzie knew nothing, why was she moving about the house for over an hour and a half without reacting? Why was there no response at all until she herself discovered the second victim? Psychologists later argued that to understand Lizzie, we need to stop forcing her into a template. Instead, we should look at the ecosystem around her, where silence was taught as a survival tool and emotional neutrality was considered a moral virtue. She once said, "I think someone was very angry, but I don't know who." Another unusual action from Lizzie drew attention. She told police she had burned a stained dress. What raised suspicion was the timing. She did it just days after the killings. That's why prosecutors argued that the dress had been bloodstained and that Lizzie burned it to destroy evidence. Lizzie was held for multiple rounds of questioning. Each time, her statements shifted slightly. Her location changed with each retelling, first downstairs, then in the barn. At times, she heard nothing. Then, she recalled a noise. Maybe the cat, she said. Each small change, when placed side by side, formed a map of linguistic instability. In criminal behavior analysis, consistency is a key factor. Innocent people tend to tell a seamless story because they don't have to calculate what to remember. Guilty people are different. They build a structure, then must find ways to recall that structure through every interrogation. One criminal investigator at the time remarked, "The problem wasn't what she said. It was that every answer felt overly considered." I've read hundreds of lines from her interviews. Every answer from Lizzie was short, sufficient, devoid of emotion. One response in particular stood out to me. When asked why she hadn't heard anything that morning, she replied, "Because I was in my room, and sometimes the smallest sounds are the ones we choose not to hear." Maybe that was how she held on to the only thing she still had, the right to remain silent, not to explain on demand, not to retell the story the way others expected. In a society where women were expected to show remorse, to be soft-spoken, Lizzie stepped outside that mold. It may sound strange, but I was struck by how she refused to become a character in someone else's script. Lizzie was indicted on December 2nd, 1892. The trial of Lizzie Borden lasted 14 days, and during that time, the American press reached a level of frenzy unlike anything before. Each session drew massive crowds, curious citizens and reporters alike, showing up day after day. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken. Journalists fought for spots in the front rows. People gathered outside, pressing against the windows, trying to catch a word or two through the open slits. A family murder case. 2 victims, 1 surviving member, and a cloud of uncertainty hanging over it all. When Lizzie Borden entered the courtroom, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. A long black dress, a high hat, a face untouched by emotion. Her gaze was steady, composed. Throughout the trial, Lizzie remained silent. She sat still, listening quietly, as if the accusations were not landing on her, but drifting past, separated by a wall of thick glass. People expected something, a breakdown, a tear, a moment of instinct. But they were wrong. What they saw was a woman maintaining calm, as if this wasn't a courtroom deciding her fate. During the proceedings, Lizzie's lawyer argued that with wounds as severe as those found at the scene, the killer would have been drenched in blood. Yet Lizzie had been remarkably clean. He even presented a witness who claimed to have seen Lizzie in the barn around the time of the murders. The defense also dismissed the claim that her attempt to buy poison from a pharmacy indicated motive, but the prosecution countered. They built a psychological profile. They focused on the inconsistencies in her statements, the burned dress, the lack of emotional coherence, and above all, what they described as too calm to be innocent. One witness recalled, "When the stepmother's name came up, Lizzie shifted slightly in her seat, like she was trying to separate herself from that name to avoid letting it touch her again." People said Lizzie didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just sat there, silent and distant. The prosecutor called it a sealed wall, blocking every path to the truth. Experts in criminal psychology analyzed Lizzie's behavior as a form of extreme emotional control. They noted that in murder cases, perpetrators often crack under prolonged stress. But Lizzie only grew quieter, and it was that choice, not conforming to the expected narrative, that left the jury unsettled. One juror later said, "We sat there for hours, trying to find some shared emotional ground with her. But the longer we looked, the more she slipped away from any reasoning we tried to apply." On June 19th, Lizzie was declared not guilty. What followed was a silence, stretching from the courtroom to the headlines, where the public began asking larger questions. If not her, then who? And if it was her, why did the evidence never seem to touch her? The press didn't back off after the trial. Instead, they framed it as a fracture in the foundation of American justice. A Fall River Daily reporter wrote, "She stayed silent. The system spoke for her with an acquittal." But it was the Fall River community that reacted more strongly. An elderly neighbor said, "I saw her standing in the garden for hours doing nothing. She didn't look like someone who felt grief." A shopkeeper added, "She used to say hello. After the trial, she never spoke again." There were no protests, just stares, whispers, and a wall of distance. Anonymous letters began arriving weekly, repeating the same line, "We remember Abby. You don't." At church, the pastor held a special session to ease the tension. People weren't debating the verdict. They were debating morality, gender, and forgiveness. Some older women said, if she were a man, she'd have been hanged. Others resented that she never once apologized. After the trial, Lizzie withdrew. She stayed neutral in the face of public judgment, and that silence only deepened the debate. A scholar from the Massachusetts Historical Society noted, Lizzie Borden tested society's ability to process a suspect who refused emotional patterns. That's why the case never really ended. From that point on, the case moved beyond law. It became a lasting question about emotion, morality, and how a woman who refuses to play along can still be seen as dangerous. What she left behind was uncertainty, etched into the memory of the law. I once asked a professor about the difference between a verdict and a truth. She replied, "A verdict needs evidence. A truth only needs a lingering unease." The Lizzie Borden case never had enough evidence, but the public was never at ease. I often think about the idea of moral identity in 19th century American society, a world where women were expected to embody repentance, emotion, and family. When Lizzie walked out of court without showing any emotion, that void became part of what made this one of the most enduring cases in American history, layered with contradictions and impossible knots. Why did a woman stepping away from a gruesome crime stir such discomfort in the public? To me, this wasn't just a criminal case. It felt like a test of society's limits, a true crime documentary that opens layers of reflection, raising questions about how long we've forced women into a single emotional mold, and how deeply that mold still shapes our judgment today. If this story made you pause, subscribe for more cases that don't just ask what happened, but why it still matters.